we're going to be creating this texture. So it's called moss stitch in the UK and seed stitch in the US. It's a combination of one knit stitch, one purl stitch, and then instead of creating these columns, we're going to alternate them to create these bumps and little spaces between the bumps. So with moss stitch, unlike rib, when we see a little V facing us, instead of knitting it, we want to purl it. So it's basically the opposite of what we did with the rib. So for this row, I'm going to start with a purl stitch. So I'm starting a purl stitch on my wrong side row, so I can remember when I have this little tail at the starting end, I'm starting with a purl. So that's one purl stitch, and then exactly how we did before, I'm going to now move this yarn to the back between those two needles and then knit my next stitch. So we're doing exactly the same techniques, we're just doing them in the opposite order. So I'm purling the ones that look like V's and I'm knitting the ones that look like a horizontal bar. And as you'll see, you're starting to disrupt the rib pattern, and now you're getting this kind of alternating bumpy pattern. So because I started with a purl stitch and I have an even number of stitches, this row is going to finish with a knit stitch. So if we were still working in rib, finishing with a knit stitch would mean that I'm going to start with a purl stitch, but because we're now working in moss stitch, now that I can see a bump facing me, I'm going to start knitting. So if you knitted the last stitch, in moss stitch you will knit the first stitch. So it's the opposite of rib. If in rib, if you finish with a knit, you would start with a purl, and in moss stitch, if you finish with a knit, you're going to start with a knit. So you're always creating these little alternating bumps. So if a bump is facing you, you want to knit it. If a little V is facing you, you want to bring the yarn to the front and purl it. So we're going to knit that one and purl the next one. So once again, I'm just going to show you what can happen if you forget to move the yarn. So I've purled that stitch and I've got an extra loop. We're going to have a look at it on the next row. So I'm going to show you what to do if you get that in your own knitting. So on this side, my last stitch is a purl stitch. So when I turn that over, I can see I've got a V facing me and I'm going to start with a purl stitch. So I'm counting my stitches now and I'm seeing that I've got this extra one here. So if I stretch all my stitches out, all the other stitches on my row are these lovely neat vertical lines, and then this one is diagonal. So I know that this stitch is not the real stitch because it's diagonal, whereas all the others are vertical. So I'm going to work in my pattern, so in my moss stitch, until I get to that little vertical thing. Sorry, the little horizontal thing, or diagonal, more diagonal. And so I'm going to work right up until the stitch before it. So I'm just working that stitch before the diagonal. And now I can tell that this isn't a stitch. It's not attached to anything. It's just this loop. So I can simply drop it off my needle, sort of pull my knitting around to close up that loop, and then carry on. So I've just purled, so my next stitch will be a knit stitch. And there you go. So if you forget to move it and you create an extra loop, you can simply drop that extra loop off the needle. It's not a real stitch, so it's not going to unravel, and hopefully you won't be able to see it. So now we've got the moss stitch pattern really starting to show. We've got the alternating bumps. So I'm going to do a couple more rows in this, and then I'll show you how to count your stitches and rows in this pattern, and then I think it'll be time to get on with the actual hat. So once again, I'm working a right side row. I have a bump facing me here. I also have my tail on the left side of my little piece, so I know it's a right side row, and I'm going to start with a knit stitch. So there's a few different tips and tricks so you know which one to start. So you can look at your actual stitches, or you can look at where your cast on tail is, or you can remember what stitch you finished on. So moss stitch, you want to start with the same stitch you finished on. So if your stitch on the previous row was a knit stitch, you want to knit your first stitch. If your last stitch on the previous row is a purl stitch, you want to purl your first stitch, and rib is the opposite. So this one, tail is at this end, looks like little vertical legs. I finished with a purl, so I'm going to start with a purl. So for this one, my tail's at this end and I've got my two little legs, so I'm going to start with a purl stitch. Okay, so there we go. We've got our 6 rows in moss stitch there.